Jesus. We just got done with Jesus' rejection from Nazareth. Starting to get my R words mixed up there, where he was rejected at least his second return, or his return to Nazareth. The second time he visited there. There may have been others, but this is what we find mentioned within the Gospels. And now we get to something that's been waited for, something that was on the horizon and expected, but it's still something of a shock for them. And that is the death of John the Baptist. At this time, he's been imprisoned. If you'll remember, we had a point where we looked earlier, a little while back, where John had sent some of his disciples to ask if Jesus was the one. But John had pointed to Jesus. John had seen the Spirit come down as a dove on Jesus and the Father speak. He'd heard that. But whenever you're in a very difficult situation, sometimes you need some reassurance. And Jesus wasn't mean. He wasn't unkind. He told those disciples of John, go tell him what you've seen. And he names off certain of the messianic prophecies that speak to the work of Messiah, the miracles of Messiah, and the gospel being preached. In other words, yes, John, I am the Messiah, is what Jesus was saying. But how many of the disciples of Jesus and others thought that John would be released? We don't know. They may have very much hoped that he would be. Any of us would. John the Baptist was a very, very straightforward prophet. But he was also a prophet that loved people, and he was very much beloved. But sometimes when you say it like it is, you make enemies. Starting in verse 1, it says, at that time, Herod the Tetrarch had heard the report about Jesus and said to his servants, this is John the Baptist. He is risen from the dead. Wait a minute. Maybe I'm way off. I don't remember. Oh my goodness. I'm having a scatterbrained day. Are you having a scatterbrained day? That's me. Well, let's go through this. This is next in line, and I think I've mixed up my timeline in my head. But Herod the Tetrarch heard the report about Jesus and said to his servants, this is John the Baptist. He's risen from the dead. Therefore, these powers are at work in him. For Herod had laid hold of John and bound him. Okay, this is given the background of it. I'm sorry. I'm having one of those days. And put him in prison for the sake of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife. Because John had said to him, it is not lawful for you to have her. And although he wanted to put him to death, he feared the multitude because they counted him as a prophet. Even Herod Antipas had some begrudging respect for John. So apparently, if memory serves correctly now, this is given the story of it, but the first portion of it is after the events. So it's kind of a recounting of why Herod thought Jesus was John brought back from the dead, because Herod's the one that killed him. But he did not kill him entirely out of desire, because he was afraid. Now, some background. Herod Antipas and Herod Philip were brothers. They had different tetrarchies, or areas that they were in charge of. After their father Herod the Great died, his kingdom was initially given to one of his sons. I think it's Archelaus, who befuddled it all and messed it all up. And Rome quickly said, no, we're not doing that, so we will now separate things into tetrarchs. And so you had different Herods in different areas, but the area of Judea was largely under direct Roman control. Of the brothers, Herod Philip was actually the most competent. His area encompassed the northern part, where you also had Mount Hermon and Caesarea Philippi. I wonder where he got that name from. But that doesn't mean he was a good man. He was just the most competent of the rulers. But sadly enough, his wife left him for his brother. Now, this is a violation of biblical teaching. It's also a violation of social norms, isn't it? Might I add, our world holds oftentimes the breaking down of social norms as something of something that they recognize as wrong, but they want to do it just because. It's forbidden. And that can go into a multiplicity of areas. Now, you could say, well, she's not his biological sister. It doesn't matter. She was married to his brother. There is a familial separation that must be maintained. Every now and then you may hear someone say, well, can a stepbrother and a stepsister get married? Well, they're not biologically connected, but there is a social, relational connection that really is not to be violated. All right? Because then if you look at someone as a sister or as a brother and then you start looking at them as something else, that's inappropriate, that's wrong. Unfortunately, there's a lot of skewing of the lines today, but it wasn't just today. It happened back then too. And so John the Baptist said, you shouldn't be with her. That's wrong. And he arrested him. But he was afraid to have him killed because he knew of the populace's respect and love for John. We find out from some of the other gospel accounts that he did converse with John. Sometimes they would converse with him, for different reasons. But the thing is, John didn't just upset Herod Antipas. He also upset Herodias. When Herod's birthday was celebrated, the daughter of Herodias danced before them and pleased Herod. Therefore, he promised with an oath to give her whatever she might ask. This was a common thing to be done, and oftentimes nothing happened. Here's the thing, she held him to it. But this is his niece who is dancing for him in a not appropriate way. You see the breakdown of multiple aspects that should never be broken down. So she, having been prompted by her mother, said, give me John the Baptist's head on a platter. So Herodias was so angry, she schemed to have John killed. And the king was sorry. Nevertheless, because of the oaths and because of those who sat with him, he commanded it to be done, to be given to her. In other words, he was more afraid of those that were his friends and allies looking down on him, that he did what he knew was wrong. Herod Antipas might not be the most evil person you've ever heard of. When you read about him, he's disgusting, he's irritating, but he's not the worst guy ever. But he knows better. So he sent and had John beheaded in prison, and his head was brought on a platter and given to the girl, and she brought it to her mother. Then his disciples came and took the body and buried it and went and told Jesus. Now, here's something I want you to think about. How would this have affected Jesus? And do remember his dual nature, God and man, all right? He loved John as the divine person he was. He also loved John as the human portion of him was. He loved John. Now, he knew John would be resurrected one day. He knew John was with God the Father. He knew all that. Does it change the fact that he loved John and he hated that these things would happen? I don't think it changed that fact. And the reason I think I can say that is, let's look over at some point when you get a chance, and I think it's John chapter 11. And that's where Jesus goes to raise Lazarus from the dead. Jesus cried there too. Or he cried there. I think that crying had a lot to do with the lack of faith. But did he care about Lazarus? Yes. He knew where he was. He knew his heart, but he still cared. John completed his purpose. It wasn't the purpose that everyone expected, but it was his purpose. And he completed that. He did all that he was supposed to do. What's sad is how he was treated, how he was abused and mistreated, and all that occurred. What can we take from all this? I want you to know Jesus cared. There's no doubt Jesus cared. Remember when the disciples of John came to Jesus at John's behest to ask, are you really the one? Jesus didn't treat John negatively. Jesus gave encouragement and evidence. And I think those should go together. It's very easy sometimes to be a little harsh, but he wasn't. I think we can take something from this situation. Herod should not have been with his sister. Herod should not have been watching his niece dancing for him. Herod should not have made a promise that he never intended to keep, and Herod should never have taken the thoughts and the considerations of those around him more than God. The problem is when we put ourselves in situations violating what God has set up for us, it really easily can become a domino effect and everything getting worse. He should not have been with a woman that was supposed to be a sister to him. He should not have looked at his niece in this way whatsoever. He should not have been around people that were opposed to the way of God, and he should not have been led to violate the sanctity of human life. You know, there's going to be someone else that at least that latter part's going to have a problem with too. Who's going to do something similar. The rest of it, maybe not so much, and that's going to be someone by the name of Pontius Pilate. He gets put in between a rock and a hard place when it comes to Jesus. He doesn't want to kill Jesus. I'm not sure he cared about Jesus one way or another, but he didn't like being put in the position, and he didn't want people to be angry with him for killing Jesus, but he didn't want the Jewish leaders to be angry with him for not hurting Jesus. And even his wife warned him, but he felt like he was in between a rock and a hard place. Here's my question for you and me. When we're in between the rock and the hard place, and those places occur, we will find ourselves there maybe once, twice, maybe more than that. Are we willing to give up what we know to be right just to get through? Or are we going to be dedicated to God no matter the hardship that comes? The latter part is what we should do, but the question has to be, is it what we will do? Only we can answer that. But you know what makes it a little easier to answer yes? If we consistently and dedicate ourselves to God and maintain our close connection to Him, fellowship with Him, it makes it a lot easier to do so. The further we are in our fellowship with God, the easier it is to get further and further away and make wrongful decisions. So, forgive my earlier scatterbrainness. And this is a little shorter than I normally like to go, but it's one of those days. But let's be in prayer for one another.